The death of Marilyn Monroe has plagued Hollywood and the world for over 60 years. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a movie star. She stood for beauty, vulnerability, and intrigue. When she died in 1962, found unresponsive in her Los Angeles mansion, the conclusion of her death was quick. There was no doubt it was a probable suicide by overdose. Yet, whispers began circulating about something much more sinister. Was Marilyn Monroe's death truly a suicide? Or had Marilyn Monroe posed some kind of threat to power brokers? Power brokers with secrets and agendas. Despite numerous programs and investigations on this tragic event, truth remained elusive. Authorities wrapped up this case fast. Yet, those who knew Marilyn Monroe insisted this explanation just wasn't right. There just weren't answers about witness testimony, suspicious behavior of those involved at the scene, or just where certain evidence might be. Some allegations cited it's been covered up. Others blamed it all on the cold indifference of Hollywood. And some small fingers just blamed it on certain politicians whose name just wasn't ever to be associated with Marilyn Monroe's. Today, though, new light has been shed on this death in Hollywood. Interviews have unleashed new answers about Marilyn Monroe's death. And it seems now this death in Hollywood wasn't just tragic. Perhaps it wasn't even an accident. And this truth? This truth has been much grayer than anyone could ever have imagined. From orphan to Marilyn Monroe, Marilyn Monroe's life has been anything but glamorous. From early life to stunning Hollywood star, Marilyn Monroe's early life has never been glamorous. Born June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles, California, Marilyn Monroe's start in life has never been glamorous. When she arrived on this earth, Marilyn's start would be but the start of something truly tragic. Marilyn Monroe would be born Norma Jean Mortensen. Yet, from day number one, Marilyn's birth would be but the start of something decidedly different. Marilyn Monroe's birth would be but the start of something that just wasn't ever meant to be. There would be no father to sign this birth certificate. Yet, Marilyn's mother would have to put up with severe mental problems. This meant Norma Jean would never truly experience childhood. Instead, Marilyn Monroe's early life would be but the start of something full of turmoil. Marilyn would live with foster families from 1935 to 1942. Yet, it would be but part of Marilyn Monroe's early life. Living with foster families would end with Marilyn entering an orphanage. Yet, Marilyn Monroe would never live with foster families or in this orphanage. These would be but Norma Jean's early life years. Yet, Marilyn Monroe would never truly live within this early life. Early life would be but something Marilyn would never experience or remember. Yet, this would be but the start of something truly different. These would be but some early life years that Marilyn Monroe just would never truly experience. These would be but some early years Marilyn Monroe would never truly see. Yet this would be but the start of something truly different. These would while other children played in secure settings. Norma Jean learned quickly that nothing was ever set in stone, and one had to be prepared to adjust rapidly in order to survive. Life in the orphanage was orderly, though hardly comforting. Norma Jean's mother remained physically and emotionally absent from her life, spending much time in hospitals being treated for mental problems. Since she had no father and her mother was declared incompetent to raise her, Norma Jean was declared a ward of the state. This marked the beginning of the psychological groundwork which would later affect her romantic relationships, her identity, and the image she would construct later on for the outside world. By the time June 1942 had rolled around, at only 16 years old, Norma Jean made a choice which would forever alter the course of her existence. She married a 21-year-old neighbor named James Dougherty. This is certainly no romantic teenage union. Instead, she made the best of a rather dismal situation. Norma Jean's foster home was about to end, and with nowhere else to go, she could easily be consigned back to an orphanage. This time, she opted for a more acceptable alternative, marriage. Even as a teenager with virtually no experience at all, she assumed the role of wife, taking on adult responsibilities years before she was truly mature. She did this because she believed at the time that this would at last provide her with the one thing she had always lacked: security. When James enlisted with the Merchant Marine during World War II, Normine opted to remain in California. In order to contribute towards the war effort as well as support herself financially, she got a job at a munitions factory in Venice in 1944. It was at this factory, amidst the sound of machinery and the usual wartime schedule, that destiny struck. A military photographer assigned the duty of taking morale-boosting pictures of the women who contributed towards winning the war showed up. This photographer was struck with Normine's photogenic quality and offered to take her picture. This was only the beginning. The photograph would eventually result in offers involving modeling work, and she soon found herself contracted by a modeling service. Norma Jean proved highly talented at camera work. Her looks impressed, but it was more than that. She had presence, she had charisma, which would be captured in photograph form as well. Before long, she found herself in great demand as a pin-up model, appearing in various publications and calendars. Her popularity mushroomed, and so did her confidence. From a shy girl at foster homes, she was turning out to be a woman who knew how to work a room and get attention. The modeling brought about a certain level of independence, exposure, and most importantly, a ray of hope for a bright and promising future for this bright and young girl who came from a poor background. In 1946, recognizing the growing popularity of this teenage girl, Norma Jean signed a studio contract with 20th Century Fox, a first for a girl who came from a background where modeling alone wasn't enough for survival or making a living a decent one at that. Of course, along came another change too. The executives at 20th Century Fox deemed her stage name inadequate for stardom and required a change for the better, something glamorous, at best, and more fabulous than Norma Jean Mortenson. This is when Marilyn Monroe came about, named after a stage star Marilyn Miller, and Monroe after her mother's maiden name, a complete changeover for a girl who would now be required to separate her personal persona from her movie identity. A duality which would hamper Marilyn for many years to come. Marilyn now sported a new identity, one where she appeared in minor movie roles too. Between 1947 through 1950, Marilyn spent many years working steadily, behind the scenes in a quiet manner in Hollywood, picking up bits and bits of movie roles in low-budget films and flicks in such a manner as if learning about this movie magic business firsthand. Learning by watching seasoned actors and learning movie magic dynamics firsthand. Her first movie breakthrough came about in 1947 when she appeared in a minor movie called Dangerous Years, a movie about a crime subculture where Marilyn portrayed a waitress named Evie, doing absolutely nothing for Marilyn herself, but getting a toehold in a movie for the first time in a manner very different from modeling, where she merely posed around. She wasn't posing around anymore. She actually acted. In ensuing years, Marilyn continued picking up minor movie roles one by one, doing nothing memorable enough or enough in the headlines, but doing nothing but paving a road towards a bright and promising movie career for Marilyn, one who would definitely learn movie tricks by watching seasoned actors from up close. They would do nothing but bring Marilyn closer towards movie knowledge in varying degrees. They would bring about a level of learning come movie exposure for Marilyn. A girl who needed nothing but exposure in varying degrees. They brought about a level of learning in movie dynamics for Marilyn, a girl who would need nothing at best but experience as is. They brought about a level of movie exposure and learning about movie dynamics by watching seasoned actors from up close, nothing less than a level of as is exposure in varying degrees. They would lay a road towards movie stardom indeed. Her working ethic was apparent, and she brought professionalism to all performances, no matter how small. One of the most notable performances during this time was in The Asphalt Jungle, 1950, critically acclaimed film about crimes that was directed by John Huston. Although her time on screen was short, she performed the role of Angela Finley, a young lover of a corrupt lawyer. This performance did not go unnoticed. Instead, she managed to impress both critics and audiences. This was the first time that she was not merely a pretty face in a small role. This performance highlighted that she not only had the face of an actress, but also talent and potential. By now, in 1950, The change was almost complete. The insecure and cold child who was formerly known as Norma was now Marilyn Monroe, a face that was growing on the scene of Hollywood. Marilyn Monroe was a name that did not ring out just yet, but there was potential for stardom, and she was well on the path to achieving this. The change over from photographing for advertisements to acting was not merely accidental. It was not merely a random path that she decided to follow. Instead, Marilyn Monroe chose to deliberately pursue this and was prepared for all the painful and difficult-to-deal-with repercussions that came with the territory of acting for a male-dominated industry. Marilyn Monroe and trauma. Marilyn Monroe's trauma, type of Marilyn Monroe's trauma casting and studio conflictians. This was despite Marilyn Monroe gaining immense popularity within the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was not merely the case that the early challenges that Marilyn Monroe had faced were left behind when she was on the up within the acting scene, because the years of Marilyn Monroe growing up, years of Marilyn Monroe being within foster homes, the feeling of abandonment that Marilyn Monroe had because of this, and the emotional instability that Marilyn Monroe received from her mother continued to haunt Marilyn Monroe throughout the latter years of Marilyn Monroe's life. It was not merely the case that Marilyn Monroe was struggling because of gaining immense fame and finding the pressure difficult to deal with. Instead, Marilyn Monroe should not be solely looked upon because of the immense success and extreme beauty that she was blessed with, because Marilyn Monroe suffered from large levels of anxiety and depression that had not merely resurfaced, because of the immense pressure that Marilyn Monroe was receiving because of gaining immense fame, but because of the immense emotional turmoil that Marilyn Monroe was receiving on a day-to-day basis because of a childhood that did not offer tranquility or a mind that was constantly torn apart because of emotional instability that Marilyn Monroe had inherited because of her mother. Marilyn was also known to have difficulty sleeping, and it is during this period that her dependency on prescription drugs commenced. This woman, who appeared confident, radiant, and in control to the world, was also excessively vulnerable to criticism and rejection. This vulnerability had, no doubt, resulted from her turbulent childhood years. The woman behind the image had also been suffering from emotional trauma, some of which were left unaddressed. Since then, Marilyn had also had to learn how to perform not only before the camera, but also in real life, by learning how to paste a smile onto her face and exude charm, even when she was literally falling apart. This, along with the tormented life, is the effect of the role Hollywood chose for her. The role Hollywood chose for Marilyn Monroe is one where she is remembered as the ultimate sex symbol of her generation. This role, while making her a star, also circumscribed her. This is because Marilyn was frequently cast into the role of the dumb blonde. This is a role both the studios and the audiences expected her to fulfill. The machinations set up by the promotional machinery of Hollywood resulted in this image finding immense favor, but this took a great toll on Marilyn. Marilyn's appearance, along with her acting skills, resulted in her becoming a star, but it also resulted in audiences' failure to recognize her acting skills, as well as her desire for being taken seriously. The truth is, Marilyn was anything but the vapid image she had to assume. This woman was an avid reader, had taken immense pains to learn acting, and had also shown immense interest in assuming roles that were more compounded. This, however, is something that frequently happened, where the roles offered to her were those where her appearance mattered more as opposed to her intelligence, as well as where she had to assume the roles designated by the industry. This, while making her more popular, also left her unfulfilled. This is because she knew that there existed scope for her assuming roles, exploring herself, but such opportunities were rare. Marilyn was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the way in which she was being treated, both in terms of the roles that were being offered to her and the compensation that was being paid to her. Despite the fact that Marilyn was one of the most bankable stars to emerge from the studio, she was regularly undervalued for the role that she played in relation to her co-stars, and was not given any real input in terms of the way in which her career was being developed. The studio executives felt as though Marilyn was simply a product, an asset that could be merchandised to the public through the use of her attractiveness and public persona. However, Marilyn felt as though she was an artist and wanted to be recognized as such. Her contract renegotiations became more intense and more heated. She walked off movie sets, refused to take parts that were an insult to her intelligence, and was even suspended when she refused to follow the instructions of the studio executives. These were more than simply tantrums. These were acts of defiance on the part of a woman struggling to take back control of her identity and her career. Her unwillingness to simply go along with what the rest of the industry wanted from her was extremely refreshing, especially in a time when very few women were willing or able to take a stand against the studio executives. The divorce, addiction, and emotional collapse. Marilyn Monroe was a woman struggling to define her identity and to take back control of her career. But Marilyn Monroe was also a woman struggling to get the very most out of her personal relationships. Marilyn was a woman with a very fragile exterior, an exterior that was reflected in the characters that Marilyn played on the big screen. But Marilyn was also a woman who was struggling very much to define her own sense of identity when it came to her personal relationships. Marilyn was a woman who was simply looking for something more, but unfortunately, that something more simply never came to her. Marilyn was a woman who was married 3 times, all of which ended in divorce. These were not casual relationships or simply passing flings. These were relationships that Marilyn thought would help to give to her the emotional foundation that Marilyn was never able to get when she was a child. These relationships unfortunately ended in both emotional turmoil and the crushing weight of fame. Instead of helping to heal the emotional wounds that Marilyn experienced when she was a child, they simply became something much worse. But the one that coffee describes, and the one that Marilyn Monroe is perhaps best known for, was with Joe DiAgeo, one of the greatest baseball legends of all time in America. On the surface, their relationship seemed perfect. 2 of the greatest icons of American popular culture, uniting in their love of each other. However, the reality of the relationship is far more complex. Marilyn and Joe married in the height of Marilyn's fame in 1954. But the relationship from the very beginning is tense. Joe, known for being the stoic and private type, had no easy time with Marilyn's public persona, and more so, being the sex goddess that the public and the films required of her. This, of course, clashes with the more traditional values of DiAgeo. This quickly escalated into full-blown control madness. DiAgeo, by all accounts, is jealous and possessive, particularly over Marilyn's public outings and the attention that she received from the opposite sex. Perhaps the most famous instance of their troubled relationship is the famous subway grate from the movie 7-Year Itch, where Marilyn's white dress flies up in front of the public. This, by all accounts, DiAgeo was furious over, both at the exposure and at the presence of the cheering, and for the most part, male public. This, of course, is the pinnacle of the problem of the relationship. Marilyn embracing her newfound freedom and career, while DiAgeo wanted the private, traditional life. There were also complaints of mental and physical abuse that marred the relationship, and of course, painted a different, much bleaker perspective of the Hollywood love nest that Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiAgeo shared. Marilyn, the woman who had spent all of her earlier years trying desperately to gain freedom and power that the childhood that she'd left behind, is once again placed into a situation where her voice is not heard and her decisions doubted. Marilyn files for divorce only 9 months after the wedding, citing mental cruelty. Thus, while Joe confessed his regret and remained involved with her life, in some aspects, the relationship left obvious scars. Other marriages that Marilyn had were much the same, hopes and dreams of connection and happiness, but all of them, at the end of the day, failed not only because of the difficulties of being involved with one of the most famous women of all time, but also due to the unique personal problems that each one of the men had. Marilyn wanted to experience love and stability. However, such experiences were few for Marilyn.